They found the skull buried deep in the earth, tucked gently beneath layers of soil that hadn't been disturbed in thousands of years. Its surface was worn, the bone dry and brittle, but still intact, except for the hole. A perfect, clean-edged circle carved straight through the top of the skull. Not shattered, not cracked, not violent, deliberate. It wasn't the mark of a wound, it was the mark of a hand. Someone had cut into this man's head, not recently, not with steel or anesthesia, but 7,000 years ago, and somehow, he survived. Real quick, if stories of forgotten history intrigues you, consider subscribing for more. Now, let's keep digging. The healing made it undeniable. New bone had begun to grow along the edges of the hole, slowly, unmistakably, over time. This wasn't a post-mortem mutilation or an accident. It was a procedure, performed while the man was still alive, and he lived long enough for his body to try repairing the damage. That small ring of regrowth changed everything, because it proved that someone in the deep prehistoric past knew how to cut into the human skull without killing the person inside. No textbooks, no hospitals, no modern medicine, just stone tools, hands, and knowledge. Knowledge we didn't think they were supposed to have. The site where the skull was discovered was unremarkable at first glance. A Neolithic burial ground in what is now Ukraine, scattered with clay fragments, bone tools, and the remains of early agricultural life. People here lived in small clusters. They raised animals, farmed the land, and buried their dead in fetal positions, curled on their sides like they were preparing to return to the earth. But this grave was different. This grave held a mystery that even modern archaeologists couldn't immediately explain, because brain surgery is one of those things we associate with the peak of civilization. We imagine sterile rooms, humming machines, teams of surgeons hovering over a shaved head while digital monitors flash in the background. We don't imagine it being done with flint blades and no anesthesia on the packed dirt floor of a hut lit only by fire. But that's exactly what this skull suggests. It wasn't an anomaly either. It was just the latest in a growing line of discoveries that point to something far older, far more advanced, and far more disturbing than most people realize. The procedure is called trepanation, the intentional removal of a section of the cranial bone. Not a full craniotomy, not a fracture, but a controlled, purposeful incision. Sometimes round, sometimes square, but always placed with care. In this case, it was centered high on the skull, near the parietal bone, a spot modern neurosurgeons still target when relieving intracranial pressure. That choice wasn't random. Whoever did this knew. And here's the part that makes it impossible to ignore. This skull is not unique. Similar ones have been found all over the world. In France, in Peru, in Sudan, in Russia. Some even older than this one. Some with multiple trepanations, suggesting not only that the patient survived the first time, but lived long enough to undergo the procedure again. In one case from the Andes, the same skull had 5 separate openings, each in a different stage of healing. These weren't failed attempts, they were operations. And in many of them, survival was not only possible, it was likely. In fact, in some cultures, the survival rate for trepanation has been measured at over 70%. That's not a guess. That's based on physical signs of bone regrowth, patterns of healing, and the absence of infection or trauma in the surrounding tissue. Think about that. In a time when people didn't even have written language, they were performing brain surgery with better survival rates than 19th century battlefield medicine. So how did they do it? The tools were basic: sharp pieces of flint, obsidian, or bone. The techniques varied. Some scraped the bone layer by layer in small circles until it wore through. Others carved grooves and lifted out flaps. There was no standardized method, but the precision was unmistakable. In nearly every case, the hole avoids major blood vessels and stays clear of critical bone sutures. That kind of consistency isn't luck, it's experience. What's even more intriguing is where these trepanations show up. They appear in cultures that had no contact with each other, no shared religion, no language, no trade. Just the same practice, repeated independently across thousands of years and thousands of miles in Neolithic Europe, in the highlands of Peru, in Iron Age China, in the South Pacific, all of them putting holes in skulls, not to kill, but to heal. Some were done after trauma, blunt force injuries, fractures, signs of swelling. That makes sense. If someone takes a blow to the head, pressure builds. The brain pushes against the skull. Today, we drill to relieve it. Back then, it seems, they did too. But not all the trepan skulls show signs of injury. In fact, many appear to have been perfectly healthy before the surgery. That's where the explanations start to blur, because without modern diagnostics, how would they even know to operate? What signs would they look for? Was the patient having seizures, visions, hearing voices? Was the procedure physical or spiritual? Some researchers believe ancient trepanation was tied to ritual, a way to purge demons, to release madness, to open the soul to divine forces. The location of the hole may have corresponded with sacred beliefs about energy or thought. In some cultures, skulls with trepanations were buried separately, reverently, almost like shamans. Others were passed down as relics, worn smooth from being handled, touched, honored. In Peru, trepanation became almost routine. The Paracas culture practiced it for over 1,000 years, leaving behind hundreds of skulls with clean openings and impressive healing. In some cases, they even shaped the heads deliberately before birth, binding infant skulls to create long, sloped profiles, then cutting into them later in life as part of treatment or initiation. It's gruesome, it's precise, and it forces us to confront a possibility we're not comfortable with. That prehistoric people weren't just lucky, they were skilled, and they weren't just guessing. They had patterns, techniques, success rates. This wasn't magic, it was early medicine. The kind of medicine that came from observation, from trial and error, from watching someone suffer and daring to do something about it. We'll never know the names of these healers, never know how they learned or how many lives they lost before they got it right. But they got it right, over and over again. And maybe that's the most astonishing part, that behind every one of these skulls is not just a patient, but a practitioner, someone who had the confidence, or maybe the desperation, to press a blade to another person's skull and keep going, someone who had done it before, someone who had seen it work. We talk about the Stone Age like it was a static time of clubs and caves, but that's a cartoon. These people raised children. They buried their dead with ceremony. They planned. They learned. And when someone in the village began to scream or shake or lose their ability to speak, they didn't run. They opened the head. There's something terrifyingly human about that. It's not a story of alien technology or secret science. It's a story of blood and bone and pain, and the refusal to accept suffering as fate. The moment someone picked up a blade and said, "We're going to try," and that instinct to intervene, to cut open the body and understand what lies within, it never left us. Thousands of years after these early skulls were carved open, the practice survived into medieval Europe. Trepanation was used for treating epilepsy, migraines, head trauma, and even melancholy. In the 10th century, Persian physician al-Zahrawi described surgical instruments for removing pieces of the skull. Later, in Renaissance Italy, military doctors trepanned wounded soldiers on the battlefield, not with stones, but with iron drills and saws. They believed, just like the ancients did, that something inside the skull could go wrong, and that opening it could set it right. Of course, not everyone agreed. As medical theory evolved, trepanation began to fall out of favor. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as sterile technique became the new gold standard, the crude act of opening the skull seemed barbaric. But the procedure never fully vanished. It just changed names. It became craniotomy, decompression, neurosurgery. The tools got better, the lights got brighter, the theory got sharper, but the core act, the bold decision to go through the bone remained exactly the same. And in a strange twist of history, the ancient version of this procedure found new life in the most unexpected place. 1970s counterculture. A small group of radical thinkers, blending mysticism, science, and psychedelic experimentation, began advocating for modern trepanation, not as medicine, but as enlightenment. They believed that by drilling a hole in the skull, they could increase blood flow to the brain and return to a state of permanent high, a mental clarity that had been lost after childhood. One Dutch man filmed himself performing the procedure in his apartment. Another woman became a kind of spiritual spokeswoman for the movement, appearing in documentaries with a calm, unnerving smile and a small round dent in her forehead. They weren't trying to treat trauma, they were trying to evolve. The medical community dismissed them as reckless and dangerous. Most of their claims have since been debunked, but the fact that the practice still had power, that it could still compel people to open their own heads, speaks to something deep and ancient inside us, a fascination with the mind, a fear of what's broken, and a desperate hope that if we could just open the door, we might fix it. But none of that compares to the precision we see in the oldest skulls. Because while modern trepanation relies on imaging, planning, and anesthesia, those ancient surgeons had none of it. And yet, some of the most surgically perfect trepanations in history weren't done in hospitals. They were done in caves. There's one case in particular that still haunts researchers. In the hills of southern France, deep in a limestone cavern untouched for thousands of years, archaeologists uncovered a human skull lying alone in the dark. The burial was incomplete. No other bones, no offerings, just the head. And at its crown, a hole, perfectly circular, edges beveled, smoothed, uninfected. The hole had begun to heal before death. But more than that, it was placed in a location that modern neurosurgeons recognized instantly. The exact spot for treating certain types of intracranial pressure, not an inch off. At first, researchers believed it must have been altered in recent times. The cut was too clean, too deliberate. But radiocarbon dating told the truth. It was over 6,000 years old, and the surrounding sediment had never been disturbed. This wasn't vandalism. It was surgery. And that discovery raises a question we're still not ready to answer. Did these ancient people simply stumble upon a crude but effective trick? Or was there a deeper understanding at play? Did they observe patterns in injury and illness? Did they know how pressure affected the brain? Could they read behavior like symptoms and choose the right time, the right place, the right patient? Because if they could, it means we've underestimated them, not just in skill, but in mind. We've assumed the past was blind, but this isn't blind. This is decision, precision, repetition. And if you believe that knowledge like that doesn't just appear in one place, then you have to accept something even stranger, that multiple civilizations, separated by oceans and time, discovered the same brutal miracle on their own. That humans, given nothing but stone, fire, and the will to survive, found their way inside the skull. What does that say about us? That we are born with the drive to cut open what we don't understand. That we would rather risk death than live with the unknown. Or maybe it says something simpler. That when the pain becomes too great, when the shaking starts, or the confusion, or the visions, someone always steps forward, not to destroy, but to open, to heal, to try. It's easy to forget that these skulls belong to real people, not just symbols of mystery or milestones in medical history, but individuals who lived, suffered, and allowed themselves to be operated on without any guarantee they'd survive. And behind them always was someone who picked up the blade, someone who believed they could help. The more we study these ancient surgeries, the more we realize they weren't fringe events. They were common, systematic. In some burial sites, up to 1 in 10 adult skulls show signs of trepanation. That's not experimental, that's institutional. It suggests a kind of prehistoric medical tradition, a knowledge base passed down through time, not in books, but in memory. in scars, in rituals performed by firelight with stone blades and steady hands. Imagine what that looked like. A patient lying still, sweating, trembling, or maybe already unconscious from trauma. The healer crouched over them with only instinct and experience to guide them. No x-rays, no oxygen, no antiseptic. Just the soft tap of obsidian against bone, the hiss of the wind through the trees outside, the sound of your own heartbeat echoing in your ears as the blade gets closer to the brain. And still, they did it. Not once, not in one village, but across generations, across continents, across thousands of years. And then it disappeared. We don't know why. Maybe it was cultural collapse. Maybe it was absorbed into other medical systems and forgotten. Or maybe it was suppressed. Trepanation, after all, is one of those things that walks the edge between genius and horror. Too easy to misunderstand, too easy to label as primitive superstition or sadistic cruelty. But that's not what the evidence shows. Because in the healed skulls, we see something very different. We see intent, skill, success. They didn't kill their patients, they saved them. And for that to happen, they had to know more than we think. They had to understand blood flow, at least intuitively. They had to recognize signs of trauma, infection, pressure. They had to know how to stop bleeding, how to keep the wound clean, how to keep the patient alive during and after. That means more than just surgery. It means post-operative care. Someone had to clean the wound, feed the patient, keep them from infection in the days that followed. That kind of care doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's cultural, it's shared, it's preserved, and it changes how we see them. Not as primitives carving holes in heads out of fear or ignorance, but as early scientists, early doctors, people who looked at suffering and said, we can do something about this, even if it's dangerous, even if it hurts. And isn't that what medicine still is? The difference is we now have tools, machines, protocols. They had none of that. Just the raw human will to understand what was going wrong inside the skull and the courage to act. What they didn't have were names. We don't know who the first person was to try it. We don't know who taught it. We don't know how many failed before someone survived. All we have are bones. Bones with windows cut into them. Bones that tell us someone lived through the unthinkable. But maybe the anonymity is the point. Because this wasn't about fame. It wasn't about titles. It was about need. It was about what happens when someone begins to scream and won't stop. When seizures strike and won't let go. When a fall cracks a skull but the person doesn't die. They just get worse, slower, confused. The ancients didn't have scans, but they had eyes. And they saw what pain looked like. And then they acted. There's a theory that the drive to heal is as old as language, that as soon as we understood pain, we started trying to stop it. That the first doctor wasn't a genius or a shaman, but a friend, a mother, a man watching his brother suffer. The first operation wasn't about technique, it was about love. And if that's true, then trepanation isn't some exotic horror. It's the oldest story we have. Not the story of how we broke things, but how we tried to fix them. There's one skull from early Mesopotamia, possibly 5,000 years old. The cut is rectangular, almost surgical, positioned precisely over the area that would now be associated with language and speech. No signs of fracture or trauma, just the opening. Some believe it was done to treat sudden mutism or personality change, perhaps after a stroke. The patient lived for weeks, maybe longer. There's no record of success or failure, just the evidence that someone tried. That's the recurring pattern. They always tried. In South America, high in the Andes, trepan skulls have been found with perfectly aligned edges, drilled so symmetrically they form concentric rings. One skull even shows two overlapping trepanations. The first one partially healed, the second larger and more centered. The person survived both. Think about that. Not only did someone open their skull, they did it again. That means follow-up care. That means the procedure was not only accepted, but trusted. And that changes the way we talk about these people. They weren't lucky. They weren't guessing. They were practicing a kind of medicine we still barely understand. And they did it under conditions that should have made survival impossible. It makes you wonder what else they knew. Did they have herbal treatments for infection? Did they use alcohol or opium or other plants to dull the pain? Did they understand pressure inside the skull the way we understand fever, something invisible but deadly? And if they understood that, did they understand the mind? Did they know that damage to certain areas caused hallucinations or blindness or memory loss? There's evidence that some cultures linked trepanation to altered states, visions, prophecy, healing dreams. Some believe that the holes were made not just to heal, but to invite something in or let something out. It's impossible to separate the medical from the mystical in a world before science had its name, but maybe that's the point. Because even now in modern hospitals, we open the skull to fix the mind, and sometimes we fail. Sometimes, even with all our tools, the person doesn't return, and we're left with a question, a silence, a mystery, the same mystery the ancients must have faced, kneeling beside a still warm body, wondering if the hole was wide enough, if the pressure had been relieved, if the demons had been cast out, or if they had simply come too late. In the end, what we're left with isn't answers, it's questions carved into bone. A circle here, a square there, clean, purposeful, quietly waiting in the dirt for someone to notice, for someone to understand what it meant to take a blade to the skull and do it not out of violence, but hope. That's the true weight of this story. Not that they did it, but that they meant to. That they cut into the most sacred part of the human body, not to destroy, but to repair. They weren't butchers, they were healers, and what they lacked in tools, they made up for in courage. Because nothing about this was safe. There were no gloves, no sterilized steel, just breath and firelight and a shaking hand. The patient may have been tied down, or trusted the practitioner enough to stay still. We'll never know, but we do know they lived. The skulls prove that. The regrowth, the smooth edges, the healed bone, the absence of infection. All of it tells us that they survived what should have killed them, that someone went into their skull and left them alive. It forces us to reevaluate everything we thought we knew about the people who lived before us. We tend to look backward with arrogance, assuming that intelligence is cumulative, that the farther back we go, the less capable people were. But these skulls are evidence of a different kind of intelligence, not technological, but tactile, not digital, but deeply human, an intelligence rooted in the body, in experience, in the ability to see suffering and do something about it. We look at a 7,000-year-old skull with a hole in it and see the primitive past, but maybe that's not what it is. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe that hole is a sign of progress, not the kind we can measure in megabytes or engines, but the kind that whispers across generations, the kind that says, "We tried," and that's what makes it so haunting. Not the hole itself, but the fact that it worked, that someone cut through skin and bone and risked everything. And it wasn't a death sentence. It was survival, a scar, a second chance. There's one final case that lingers in the minds of archaeologists. A child, no more than 8 years old, found buried in a small grave in modern-day Morocco. Her skull had a hole in it, trepanned cleanly with a stone tool. It was smaller than most, but precise. The edges had begun to heal. She had lived for days or weeks or more, but not long. The grave was shallow, the earth dry. She had been wrapped in animal skins, buried with care. We don't know why they did it. Maybe she fell, maybe she was ill, maybe she began to see things, maybe she screamed. What we know is that someone tried, that someone looked down at her small, broken body, picked up a sharpened piece of rock, and opened her skull, hoping, praying that it would be enough, that it would save her, and for a time, it did. That's the echo that runs through all of this, not the horror, not the surgery, but the attempt, the refusal to let someone die without trying. It's the same instinct that drives medicine today, the same quiet desperation behind every late-night operation, every frantic ER procedure, every hard decision made with trembling hands. And if we can feel that now, if we can call it noble today, then we owe it to them to feel it then, to look at those ancient holes and see not savagery, but sacrifice, because no one would do this unless they cared. No one would cut into the skull of a child, a warrior, a loved one, unless they believed there was something worth saving. That's what trepanation really is. It's not just a hole in the head. It's a window into a time when our tools were weak, but our intentions were strong, when we couldn't explain the mind, but we still tried to reach it. And maybe that's what scares us the most, that they weren't that different from us, that 7,000 years ago, in a world without machines or electricity, someone stood over a person they loved and did the same thing we would. They tried. They tried to fix what was broken. They tried to ease the suffering. They tried to heal the mind, even if they didn't understand it. And in doing so, they left behind something far more powerful than bones. They left proof that we've always been this way, curious, desperate, brave, and sometimes, against all odds, successful. So yes, this skull had brain surgery 7,000 years ago. But maybe the real shock isn't what they did. Maybe it's that they did it, and it worked. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more forgotten discoveries and real mysteries from deep history, subscribe and turn on notifications. Until next time, keep questioning everything.